The Roman Senate, a glorious institution that claimed to uphold the virtues of the Republic. In reality, it was the original toxic workplace filled with ambitious men who would do anything to climb the political ladder. Welcome to the dirty politics of ancient Rome, where backstabbing was more than just a metaphor. Before we talk about the cold-bloodedness of the Roman Senate, let's rewind to the very beginning. Rome, legend says it was founded in 753 BCE by Romulus and Remus, twin brothers raised by a wolf. Yes, a literal wolf. These guys were abandoned as babies, floated down a river, Moses style, and then rescued by a she-wolf who decided, yeah, I'll raise these two random human infants. Makes you wonder what kind of parenting books wolves were reading back then. And if that wasn't metal enough, once the boys grew up, they decided to build a city together. Sounds wholesome, right? Wrong. Like any good siblings, they immediately started fighting over where to put it. Ever argue with your brother about who gets the bigger bedroom? Now raise the stakes by about 1,000 and add weapons. Romulus, being the ambitious go-getter that he was, decided to settle the argument the old-fashioned way, by murdering his own brother and naming the city after himself. Classic big brother move. With his twin conveniently out of the picture, Romulus got to work setting up Rome's first government. He formed a council of 100 men from noble families, calling them the patres, which literally means fathers. Congratulations, Rome, you now have founding fathers in the most literal sense possible. But let's be real, their job wasn't just to advise the king, it was to quietly figure out how to replace him. And thus, the Roman tradition of plotting against the people in charge was born. And if you think modern politicians are sneaky, just wait until you hear what these guys pulled off. Fast forward a couple of hundred years, and the Romans had finally had enough of kings. The last one, called Tarquin the Proud, was basically the original dictator, an arrogant, ruthless tyrant who ruled like he had unlimited DLCs for corruption. The final straw? His son, Sextus Tarquin, committed a horrible crime against a noblewoman named Lucretia, which caused such an outrage that the Roman people collectively said, yeah, no, we're done here. Led by an outraged aristocrat, Lucius Junius Brutus, yes, that Brutus's ancestor, apparently backstabbing runs in the family, the Romans rose up, kicked Tarquin out, and declared that Rome would never have a king again. Good news, right? No more kings. The people rule. Democracy wins. Not exactly. Instead of a monarchy, the Senate, now drunk on its newfound power, set up a republic. And by republic, they meant a government where the rich guys still run everything, but now they pretend it's fair. Their new system included two consuls, basically co-presidents who ruled for 1 year and had to agree on everything. On paper, this was supposed to prevent any one person from getting too much power. In reality, it was like giving two toddlers the same toy and telling them they have to share. To make sure neither consul got too power-hungry, they both had veto power over each other. This sounds like a great system until you remember that Roman politicians were not known for their patience or teamwork. Picture two senators in togas, each screaming veto at each other like Sith lords stuck in a bureaucratic nightmare. If one consul wanted to build a road and the other didn't, no road. If one wanted to raise taxes but the other refused, no taxes. If one wanted to go to war and the other one wanted to, not start unnecessary wars, too bad. The Senate would find a way to do it anyway. And speaking of wars, the Republic had one more failsafe to prevent any single leader from taking too much control. The position of dictator. Yes, that sounds counterintuitive, but hear me out. In times of crisis, like say when Hannibal was knocking on Rome's front door, the Senate could appoint one guy to take absolute control for 6 months. Then when the crisis was over, he was supposed to give up power and go back to farming or writing poetry or whatever retired dictators did. This actually worked for a while, until it didn't. Because let's be real, most people don't just give up absolute power. The Senate, though, loved playing the emergency card whenever it suited them. Crisis? Boom, dictator. Another crisis? Boom, another dictator. By the time we got to the late Republic, temporary dictatorship was just another word for permanent power grab. Before the emperors turned the Senate into a glorified advisory board, these guys were the true masterminds of Roman politics, pulling the strings, flipping alliances, and backstabbing each other long before Julius Caesar made it trendy. Think of the Senate during the Republic as a mix between Succession and The Godfather, but with more laurel wreaths and fewer F-bombs. It was a political shark tank, where power belonged not to a single ruler, but to the elite families, the so-called optimates, or best men, which is exactly the kind of name a group of rich guys would give themselves. Their main goal? Keep control in the hands of the Senate and out of the grasp of ambitious generals who might, declare themselves dictator for life. But to hold on to that power, the Senate had to play dirty. Forget the noble speeches and high-minded debates. You weren't getting anywhere in Roman politics without a little bribery, a few well-placed assassinations, and the occasional rigged election. Roman politics was a blood sport, where fortunes rose and fell with a single whispered conspiracy. The Senate chambers, filled with the scent of oiled parchment and the musky aroma of too many senators packed into one space, were less of a democratic institution and more of a gladiatorial arena, except here the daggers were metaphorical. Well, most of the time. If you wanted to get anywhere in Roman politics, you needed more than just rhetoric. Senators didn't just argue policy, they plotted in the shadows, their voices hushed over goblets of spiced wine as they planned the downfall of their rivals. Backstabbing wasn't just a figure of speech, it was practically a requirement. The tension in the forum was thick enough to slice with a gladius as senators muttered darkly under their breath, their hands curling into fists beneath their embroidered togas. In fact, the early Republic was filled with political drama worthy of a Netflix series. Take the infamous case of the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, two populist reformers who made the critical mistake of thinking they could pass land reforms without making enemies. Their first mistake, believing that Rome should take care of its poor. Tiberius Gracchus wanted to redistribute land from Rome's wealthy elite to the poor, which to the Senate was about as welcome as an invading barbarian horde knocking on the city's gates. Tiberius's fate was sealed the moment he suggested his land reforms. One humid afternoon, as the sun baked the marble columns of the Senate House, his enemies made their move. The clamor of the debate turned into a full-blown riot. Panic spread like wildfire as senators, their faces twisted with rage, grabbed the nearest blunt objects, wooden chairs, stone tablets, even wax styluses, and descended upon him in a frenzied mob. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and blood as his cries were drowned out by the crack of bones breaking beneath clubbing blows. And just like that, a man who had tried to help Rome's poor was left as nothing more than a broken corpse on the floor of the Senate. Subtle. But Rome wasn't done with the Gracchi just yet. When Tiberius's younger brother Gaius took up his cause, he thought he could be smarter, faster, more strategic. But the Senate had learned its lesson too. This time, there would be no chaotic melee. No, they would let fear do the work for them. As Gaius fled through the winding streets of Rome, the scent of smoke and sewage filling his lungs, the sound of marching boots thundered behind him. The alleys, once familiar, now seemed to close in on him as he stumbled toward the Tiber. He knew what awaited him if he was caught. Public execution, humiliation, his body tossed to the vultures like a criminal's. Rather than give his enemies the satisfaction, he took his own life on a bridge, the final breath escaping his lips as the murky waters swallowed him whole. But the Senate wasn't finished. Just in case anyone else got any bright ideas about land reform, they rounded up 3,000 of Gaius's supporters and executed them en masse. Some beheaded, some beaten to death, others simply tossed off a cliff like discarded scraps. Because in Rome, when the Senate wanted you gone, they made sure you really got the message. The Senate also had a love-hate relationship with its own generals. On the one hand, Rome needed military heroes to expand the Republic. On the other hand, those heroes had armies, and that made the Senate very nervous. Rome feared what would happen when those same generals realized they had the loyalty of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers at their command. The Senate's worst nightmare was a military leader who got too ambitious. And as history proved, that nightmare came true more than once. Ancient records tell the story of two rivals, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, whose rivalry made modern political feuds look like playground squabbles. Marius, a brilliant general and man of the people, reformed the army and gave commoners a chance to serve, earning him the devotion of the lower classes, but the sheer hatred of the Senate. When he walked through the streets, the people would cheer, their voices echoing off the towering stone walls of the Forum. To his men, he was more than just a leader, he was a savior. To the Senate, he was a problem. His old ally, Sulla, on the other hand, was an aristocrat through and through, his every word dripping with disdain for the common rabble. When Marius started pushing the Senate too hard, Sulla responded in the only way Roman senators knew how, by marching his army into Rome, declaring himself dictator, and executing thousands of his enemies. The city descended into chaos. The pungent scent of burning buildings filled the air as Sulla's men hunted his enemies, dragging them from their homes and executing them in the Forum. Blood pooled in the cracks of the stone pavement, seeping between the footprints of senators who had once thought themselves untouchable. Sulla, ever the bureaucrat, didn't just kill his enemies, he made it official. He posted lists in the Forum, detailing the names of those marked for death. If you woke up one morning and saw your name written there, you had about as much time to flee as a gladiator facing a lion with a broken sword. The streets buzzed with whispers, citizens scanning the lists with bated breath, their stomachs twisting in knots as they prayed they wouldn't see the name of a friend, a father, or a brother. Those who were condemned had nowhere to run. Within days, their heads were mounted on spikes outside the Senate, their lifeless eyes staring blankly over the city they had once called home. And yet, even as Rome drowned in blood, the Senate survived. It always did. Because if history had taught Rome anything, it was this: empires rise and fall, but politics never dies. And now, the moment we've all been waiting for, the ultimate betrayal, the Senate's biggest miscalculation, Julius Caesar, the man, the myth, the walking threat to senatorial power. They thought they could control him like any other general, let him conquer some territory, win a few battles, and then call him back to Rome to quietly retire. But Caesar wasn't interested in fading into the background. He was playing a much bigger game. After years of crushing his enemies in Gaul and sending back dispatches that made him sound like a war hero straight out of Braveheart, he decided, hey, why not march on Rome and take control? So in 49 BCE, he famously crossed the Rubicon River with his army, basically declaring, your democracy is now my plaything. This was the one thing the Senate feared most, basically the ancient Roman version of ignoring a cease and desist order, and suddenly, the Senate realized they'd created a monster. Civil war followed, and when Caesar emerged victorious, he made sure to rub it in by declaring himself dictator for life. The Senate had one last trick up its sleeve, the good old-fashioned assassination route. On March 15th, 44 BCE, the infamous Ides of March, a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius decided the only way to save the Republic was with knives. Lots of knives. They lured Caesar into the Senate chamber, surrounded him, and stabbed him 23 times, which is overkill by any metric, making sure the Republic was safe for all of 5 minutes. Because if they thought Rome would just go back to normal, they were dead wrong, pun intended. Instead of restoring democracy, they kicked off another civil war, and within a few years, the Republic was history, replaced by the Roman Empire. Good job, guys. With the Republic dead, the Senate's role changed. Now, instead of being the puppet masters, they were the puppets. The emperors held all the real power, and the Senate, well, they became Rome's most prestigious rubber stamp. But just because the Senate lost its power didn't mean they lost their taste for political blood. If they couldn't rule Rome, they could at least ruin it, one well-placed betrayal at a time. And let me tell you, these guys were the OGs of political scheming. Think House of Cards meets Game of Thrones, but with togas and significantly more poison. Take Emperor Claudius, for example, a guy who became emperor mostly because he happened to be hiding behind a curtain while Caligula was getting assassinated. The Senate never took him seriously, and his own wife, Agrippina the Younger, decided he was about as useful as a broken sundial. So what did she do? Oh, nothing major. Just convinced him to name her son, Nero, as his successor, and then allegedly served him a delightful mushroom dinner, laced with poison. A bit more aggressive than a passive-aggressive email, wouldn't you say? And then there's Galba, one of the lucky winners of Rome's Year of the Four Emperors, basically an imperial version of musical chairs, but instead of losing your seat, you lost your head. The Senate initially backed him, but when he started slashing government spending like some ancient world accountant, they decided he had to go. Enter Otho, a senator turned betrayer, who promised the Praetorian Guard a fat stack of cash to switch sides. The result? Galba found himself surrounded in the Roman Forum, hacked to pieces, and left headless in the street. Talk about a hostile takeover. And let's not forget Commodus, the unhinged emperor who was more interested in pretending to be Hercules and fighting in the Colosseum than actually governing. The Senate despised him, but since he was more paranoid than a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, they had to get creative. His mistress slipped poison into his wine, but he shrugged it off. Because of course he did. So the conspirators resorted to Plan B, sending in a wrestler to strangle him in the bath. That's right, Rome's elite assassinated an emperor using a professional strangler, basically making this the world's first government-sanctioned WWE match. And these are just the ones we know about. Who knows how many political enemies were accidentally tripped down the Senate steps or mysteriously choked on a grape at a dinner party. If today's politicians engage in mudslinging, Rome's Senate believed in a much more literal approach. When it came to holding on to power, they had one golden rule. If you can't outvote them, outlive them. And there you have it. The Roman Senate, the original house of political treachery. From kings to consuls, dictators to emperors, they spent centuries perfecting the art of betrayal. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit that like button and subscribe for more historical mayhem.